You've walked past castle ruins thinking they were ancient fortresses. But what if I told you those massive stone walls weren't built to keep enemies out? They were built to trap people inside. The real function of medieval castles is something historians argued about for decades, until one discovery changed everything. Picture a princess locked in a tower, brushing her impossibly long hair, waiting for Prince Charming. Beautiful story, complete nonsense. Those castle towers, they were military sniper nests, nothing more. The whole design served one purpose: give your archers the high ground so they could rain death on anyone stupid enough to attack. Romance never entered the conversation. And here's something your history teacher probably skipped. Those spiral staircases winding up the towers, they twist clockwise for a very specific reason. If you're a defender coming down, your right arm swings freely. Perfect for sword fighting. But attackers climbing up, their sword arm smashes into the central pillar with every swing. Medieval architects were sneaky like that. Now let's talk about the actual living conditions. Most tower rooms measured barely 10 feet across. That's smaller than your bathroom. Cold stone walls, no insulation, wind howling through arrow slits designed for shooting, not comfort. I've stood in these spaces during castle tours. You can barely turn around without bumping into something. The idea that anyone chose to live there seems almost comical. And the commute? Brutal. We're talking 50 to 100 steep stone steps just to reach your bed. Every single night. Then back down for breakfast. Then back up to grab something you forgot. My knees ache just thinking about it. So where did noble women actually live? In the main hall, or the adjacent chambers, places with actual fireplaces, servants within shouting distance, furniture that didn't require mountaineering to reach. The whole princess in the tower myth? Thank the Victorians for that. They wrote those fairy tales roughly 400 years after most castles were built. They never actually lived in one. They just thought towers looked romantic from the outside. Funny how that works, right? But towers weren't even the strangest part of castle life. The Great Hall, where everyone actually spent their time, had problems that would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot. Here's the thing nobody tells you about those famous Great Hall feasts. They smelled absolutely terrible. The Great Hall wasn't just a dining room, it was everything. Bedroom, courthouse, meeting room, and yes, sometimes an actual barn. Animals wandered through during winter because body heat was body heat, whether it came from a knight or a cow. Now picture trying to eat dinner in that environment. Fresh rushes got thrown on the floor regularly, not for decoration, to cover up the smell of spilled ale, rotting food scraps, and whatever the dogs left behind. They'd mix in herbs like lavender or mint to help mask the stench. It worked about as well as spraying air freshener in a gym locker room. And the smoke. Good grief, the smoke. Cooking happened right there in the hall. No separate kitchen in most early castles. Just an open fire pit with meat roasting over it. The smoke was supposed to exit through a hole in the roof. Supposed to. In reality, it hung around like an unwanted guest at a party, coating everything in a sticky layer of grease and soot. Your clothes, your hair, the tapestries, everything. The windows, forget glass. That luxury didn't show up until much later in the medieval period. Most windows had oiled animal skins stretched across them, or just wooden shutters. So your choices were darkness with some warmth or daylight with freezing drafts. But here's what really gets me. A typical castle crammed 50 to 200 people into maybe a handful of actual rooms. Privacy simply didn't exist as a concept. Everyone slept in the Great Hall together. Lords, servants, visitors, dogs. Just one big medieval slumber party every single night. The Lord's family did eat better food on a raised platform. Status mattered, but they breathed the same smoke-filled air as everyone else. So those elegant candlelit feasts you've seen in movies, pure fantasy, the reality was closer to camping indoors with 100 strangers. Speaking of unpleasant realities, let's talk about what surrounded these castles. Here's the part nobody wants to think about. That beautiful moat surrounding the castle, it wasn't filled with fresh spring water, it was basically medieval sewage. See, castles had these things called garderobes, fancy word for toilets. They were just stone chutes built into the walls that emptied directly into the moat below. Every person in that castle, sometimes 200 of them, doing their business straight into the water. But wait, it gets better. Kitchen scraps went in there too. Animal carcasses, Anything the castle needed to dispose of found its way into that moat. And unlike rivers, moats didn't flow anywhere. The water just sat there, stagnating, fermenting. The smell must have been absolutely legendary. And here's the thing that actually surprised me. The castle residents considered this a feature, not a bug. Why? Because what enemy soldier wants to wade through liquid human waste to attack a wall? The moat wasn't just a physical barrier, it was biological warfare. Now you might think at least the moats were deep enough to drown attackers. Nope. Most averaged only 5 to 8 feet deep, barely enough to slow someone down. You weren't going to drown in a medieval moat. You were going to wish you had. Falling into that toxic soup meant infections, serious ones, the kind that killed you weeks later in horrible ways. A moat didn't need to drown you when the bacteria could finish the job. But here's where medieval people got really creative. Some castles intentionally stocked their moats with fish that fed on all that waste. And then, the castle residents ate the fish. I'll let that sink in for a moment. Makes you grateful for modern plumbing, doesn't it? The moat tells you something important about medieval life. Comfort wasn't the priority. Survival was. People accepted conditions we'd consider nightmarish because the alternative was being overrun by enemies. Speaking of enemies showing up, let's talk about what actually happened when an army surrounded a castle. Because Hollywood got sieges completely wrong. Here's the thing about medieval warfare that movies get completely wrong. Sieges weren't explosive battles with flaming arrows and dramatic sword fights. They were waiting games, excruciatingly boring waiting games. The average siege lasted weeks, sometimes months. And what did attacking armies do during all that time? They camped. That's it. They set up tents outside the castle walls and waited for everyone inside to run out of food. Thrilling stuff, right? Most castles fell to starvation and disease rather than any heroic assault. The attacking commander's strategy was basically, let's see who gets hungry first. And weirdly enough, it worked almost every time. Now here's what attackers actually did with their days. They dug tunnels, built siege equipment, and died of dysentery in their camps. Seriously, more soldiers died from bad water and cramped conditions outside the walls than from actual combat. But defenders had it worse. Inside the castle, food rationing started almost immediately. After the first month, people ate horses, then rats, then boiled leather from belts and shoes. I've had some bad meals in my life, but shoe soup sounds like rock bottom. Want a number that'll surprise you? Only about 5% of medieval sieges ended with an actual storming of the walls. 5%. That means 95% of castles surrendered because people inside were starving, sick, or both. The longest recorded siege in England happened at Kenilworth Castle in 1266. 9 months. 9 months of sitting, waiting, slowly running out of everything. And the weird part is, everyone knew this going in. Castle designers knew sieges meant starvation. Attackers knew they'd lose men to disease. Defenders knew they'd eventually eat their horses. Yet this was considered normal warfare. Makes you wonder why anyone built these things in the first place, doesn't it? Well, here's the twist. Fighting wasn't actually the main point. Most of the time, castles served a completely different purpose, one that had nothing to do with war. Here's the part most history teachers skip entirely. Castles weren't military bases waiting for the next battle. They were medieval tax offices with really thick walls. The primary peacetime function of most castles? Paperwork. Lords spent their days reviewing harvest records, settling land disputes between angry peasants, and calculating who owed. What exciting stuff, right? Castle cellars weren't dungeons filled with prisoners. They were bank vaults. Grain, salted meat, barrels of ale. This was real medieval wealth. Forget gold coins. If you controlled the food supply, you controlled everything. And the system worked like this. Peasants didn't pay taxes in money because most of them never touched a coin their entire lives. They paid in labor, crops, and livestock. 3 days working the Lord's fields, 10 bushels of wheat after harvest, 1 pig at Christmas. The castle tracked every single obligation. Many castles even had dedicated counting rooms. Picture a medieval accountant hunched over parchment, tallying bushels of barley while guards stood outside. Not exactly the stuff of legends, but here's what made castles genuinely powerful. Location. A castle controlled the surrounding farmland for miles. Want to use that road? Pay the toll? Want to sell goods at the market? The Lord gets his cut. Want to grind your grain? Better use the Lord's mill, for a fee, obviously. A castle's value wasn't measured by how many soldiers it could hold. It was measured by the income of its surrounding lands. Some castles generated the equivalent of millions in annual revenue. Others sat on worthless territory and crumbled from neglect. The whole mighty fortress image, that was just the intimidation factor. The real business happened in small rooms where clerks kept meticulous records of every chicken, every cartload of hay, every day of labor owed. Speaking of intimidation, you know those dramatic drawbridges you see in every castle movie? The ones that slam shut as enemies approach? Yeah, most of those never actually existed. Here's the thing about drawbridges. Hollywood lied to you. Every castle movie shows the same scene. Enemies approach, someone yells a warning, and down comes this massive wooden bridge with chains rattling dramatically. Looks incredible on screen. Problem is, most castles never had one. The actual numbers might surprise you. Only about 1 in 10 castles ever had a working drawbridge at any point in their entire history. 1 in 10. The rest, just regular gates, wooden doors reinforced with iron strips. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. And honestly, it makes sense when you think about it. Drawbridges were maintenance nightmares. The chains rusted, the pulleys jammed, the wooden platforms rotted from constant moisture. You've got hundreds of people, horses, and carts crossing daily. That's serious wear and tear. My grandfather had a garage door that broke every winter. Now imagine that, but medieval technology and your life depends on it working. So what did castles actually use instead? The portcullis, that heavy iron grate that drops from above. No moving chains to maintain, no complicated mechanisms, just gravity doing its job. Simple, reliable, and terrifying when it slams down in front of you. Then there were murder holes. Lovely name, right? These were openings in the ceiling above the entrance passage. Attackers walk through, defenders drop rocks, boiling water, or whatever else they had handy. Some castles had 3 or 4 sets of these. Walk into one of those entrances, and you're basically in a medieval blender. But wait, if drawbridges were so rare, why does everyone think every castle had one? Blame the Victorians again. During the 1800s, wealthy families bought ruined castles and restored them. Except they added what they thought castles should have. Drawbridges looked romantic and medieval, so they installed them on castles that never originally had them. Speaking of things the Victorians got wrong about castles, there's another massive myth we need to tackle. Those armies of shining knights riding out to battle. Here's the thing about those epic movie scenes where knights come thundering out of castle gates on horseback, armor gleaming, swords raised. Never happened. Well, almost never. Castle garrisons were shockingly small. We're talking 20 to 50 soldiers on a good day. That's it. Not armies, not legions of mounted warriors. Just a handful of guys with crossbows and really bad attitudes. But where were all the knights? Living on their own estates mostly. Knights were landowners. They had farms to manage, peasants to boss around, and their own small manors to maintain. They only showed up at castles when the king actually called them for a military campaign. The rest of the time, they were basically medieval middle managers dealing with harvest reports, and those magnificent war horses you see in paintings, a single one cost roughly what a luxury car costs today. Nobody was risking that kind of investment in actual combat unless absolutely necessary. That'd be like driving your Ferrari into a demolition derby. You just don't do it. Most castles could only stable 10 to 15 horses anyway. Try launching a cavalry charge with 15 horses. I'll wait. The reality of castle defense was much less glamorous. Soldiers stood on walls. They shot arrows down at attackers. They dropped unpleasant things through murder holes. Occasionally, they poured boiling liquids on anyone stupid enough to get too close. Sword fights? Those happened, sure, but usually in tight corridors and stairwells. Not exactly room for a horse. The whole knights riding to glorious battle from their castle stronghold image? That's Hollywood. Medieval defenders were practical people. They knew standing behind thick stone walls shooting projectiles at exposed attackers was way smarter than charging out into the open. Makes sense, right? But here's what really made castle life miserable. Forget sieges. Forget battles. The weather was the true enemy. And winter inside a castle? Let me tell you, it was genuinely brutal in ways you wouldn't believe. Winter inside a castle was genuinely miserable And I mean the kind of miserable where you'd actually envy peasants. Here's the thing nobody tells you about stone walls. They don't hold heat, they hold cold. A massive stone fortress absorbed freezing temperatures and radiated that chill right back at you like some kind of medieval refrigerator. Peasants in their wooden huts with thatched roofs, actually warmer. The irony is almost painful. Now, castles did have fireplaces, big ones. But here's the catch. A single Great Hall fireplace could burn through an entire forest's worth of wood in one winter. I'm not exaggerating. Lords employed full-time woodcutters just to keep the fires going. And even then, you were only warm if you stood directly next to the flames. Take 3 steps back and you're freezing again. Those beautiful tapestries you see in museums weren't decorations. They were survival gear. People hung them on walls specifically to block the brutal drafts that whistled through every crack and arrow slit. Fashion? Absolutely not. Desperation? Absolutely. And the sleeping arrangements were something else entirely. Forget private bedrooms with cozy quilts. People slept in groups, piled together under heavy furs, sharing body heat like penguins in Antarctica. Individual beds stayed ice cold no matter how many blankets you threw on them. But here's the detail that really gets me. Water froze in bedside cups overnight. Every single morning, servants had to crack ice in wash basins before anyone could splash water on their face. Your morning routine literally started with breaking frozen water. Makes hitting snooze on a Monday feel pretty luxurious, right? The wealthy had a solution, though. They simply left. Many nobles abandoned their impressive stone fortresses during the coldest months and retreated to smaller wooden hunting lodges. Easier to heat, way more comfortable. The grand castle sat empty while its owner huddled somewhere actually warm. Building these frozen monuments cost absolutely staggering amounts of money. And the financial details, they'll make your jaw drop. Building a castle today would cost you somewhere between $30 and $50 million. And that's not even accounting for inflation on medieval labor disputes. Edward I learned this the hard way. His Welsh castle-building spree nearly bankrupted the entire country of England. Not a town, not a region, the whole kingdom. He spent more money on castles than every other government expense combined. I've made some questionable purchases in my time, but bankrupting an entire nation never made my list. Here's where it gets wild. Skilled stonemasons were so rare and valuable that kings literally kidnapped them from other countries, just snatch craftsmen right off foreign construction sites. Try explaining that one to HR. And the timeline? Forget about moving in anytime soon. A major castle took decades to complete. Some lords started building in their 20s and died of old age before the roof went on. Their grandchildren finished what they started. That's commitment. Or insanity. Probably both. Many castles never got finished at all. The money simply ran out. Walls stood half-built for generations, slowly crumbling while lords scrambled to find more funds. Medieval construction loans were brutal. But wait, you couldn't just decide to build one either. Lords needed royal permission first. Building without approval wasn't just frowned upon. It was treason. The punishment? Execution. So that fantasy of constructing your own fortress came with some serious paperwork and potential beheading. The workforce for a single major castle could exceed 3,000 workers. Quarrymen cutting stone, carpenters building scaffolding, blacksmiths forging tools, diggers moving earth by hand. 3,000 people working years on a single building makes modern construction delays look adorable. All that money, all that labor, all those decades of work. And here's the cruel twist. Just as these massive stone fortifications reached their peak, something came along that made them completely worthless almost overnight. A new weapon that could destroy in hours what took generations to build. Here's the thing about medieval castles. They didn't slowly fade into history. They became useless almost overnight. For centuries, castle walls were basically invincible. Siege armies would camp outside for months, sometimes years, trying to starve defenders out. Battering rams, walls were too thick. Catapults, minor damage at best. A well-built castle could hold off an army 10 times its size. Then cannons showed up, and everything changed. Early gunpowder weapons were clunky and unreliable. Sure, but by the 1400s, artillery had become devastating. Walls that had stood for 200 years reduced to rubble in an afternoon. I've seen castles in France where you can still spot the cannon damage, Massive holes punched clean through stone that was supposed to last forever. Castle builders panicked. They tried making walls thicker. Didn't work. They tried angling them to deflect shots. Cannon technology just improved faster. It was like bringing a sword to a gunfight, except the gunfight kept getting worse every decade. By 1500, military architects had abandoned the castle concept entirely. Star forts became the new standard. Low walls, angled bastions, completely different philosophy. So what happened to all those beautiful castles? Some wealthy families just converted them into fancy homes, knocked out those narrow arrow slits, put in actual windows, added comfortable furniture. Military fortress becomes a country mansion, not a bad retirement plan for a building. But here's what surprised me most. Governments actively demolished thousands of castles on purpose. They didn't want rebels or rival lords using them as strongholds. Cheaper to tear them down than risk someone fortifying them again. The castles that survived, mostly the ones too expensive to demolish or too remote to matter. So next time you visit a medieval castle, remember this: you're not looking at how people lived back then. You're looking at the survivors, the lucky few that escaped cannonballs, demolition crews, and the simple passage of time.